Hi, Seth here with BlenderSensei.com. Today I want to talk about making it easier to animate in Blender. One of the ways we can do that is by tweaking some preferences, a few settings, and adjusting our default workspace. Down here we have the timeline editor. So the timeline editor is one of Blender's 5 different animation editor types. The two most important editor types are the dope sheet and the timeline. But I just want you to be aware that there is an incredible amount of low-hanging fruit of amazing stuff you can do with just the timeline and the dope sheet editor without ever digging into the weeds of these more complicated animation editors. So the primary purpose of the timeline editor is really just to give us access to these animation playback controls, and then also these keyframing controls, and then menu for adjusting how we do that and adjusting various settings about keying. But it's not really a great place to animate. Within recent versions, Blender did add the ability to insert keyframes in the timeline editor, but really you need access to the dope sheet to animate things. So if we come over to the animation workspace here, you'll see that by default, the Blender team has put just access to the header of the timeline editor, because that's really all you want it for, is these animation controls and keying controls. And then we have the dope sheet displayed. So the main reason that the dope sheet is important, why you really need it displayed all the time if you're going to animate anything, is this button which displays the different dope sheet modes. So there's 6 different modes here, but there's only really 4 of them that you need to pay attention to. So there's the dope sheet, main dope sheet mode, the action editor, shape key editor, and the grease pencil dope sheet mode, which allows you to make 2D animations using Blender's awesome grease pencil. Mask and cache file editors, that's for more advanced stuff that you won't be using 95% of the time. So once again, we're trying to uncover all the low-hanging fruit when it comes to animating in Blender, which there's an incredible amount of. So let's get to that first before worrying about, animating cache files. I think one of the culprits for why so few people actually get into animating things in Blender is this kind of catch-22 going on with these workspaces. If you're not familiar with animating that much, or it seems kind of complicated or cumbersome to do, then you're likely never going to come over to this animation tab and use an even more disorienting workspace that's like different from your regular layout that you're used to doing stuff in. So I think what we need to do is adjust our default layout to be a little bit more friendly to animate, to remove that friction from ever getting started, from all of a sudden having a little idea where you'd like to experiment. So let's clean up this default layout to make it more inviting for us to animate. Okay, so the first thing is that we really do need access to the dope sheet and the timeline editor to be able to animate. So what I'm going to do is bring my mouse over into the corner of the screen until these little crosshairs pop up. Then once I see the crosshairs, I'm going to click down, drag up, and this will split open a new editor window. And I'm going to switch this one actually to the timeline. And I'm going to switch this bottom one to the dope sheet editor. The reason I'm doing that is because typically you'll be modeling or doing things in the 3D viewport, and when you want to come to and press play or pause or go back or something, if you're not using a hotkey to do that stuff, you don't want to have your mouse to travel all the way down to the bottom of the screen. So that's a little bit different from how it's laid out down here in the animation workspace. I think what you need is you need a little bit of room to see 3, maybe 4 objects in this little side window here. Because when you're animating, you're never going to be just animating one object, or very rarely will you be doing that. So typically when you're animating, you'll at least be shuffling between a couple of things that you're making interact with each other. So it's nice to have a little bit of room to not have to adjust this every single time that you decide you want to experiment and animate or something. And that removes some of that friction I was talking about, that cognitive dissonance that pops up in your brain. Your brain is constantly telling you stories, lies about how you don't need to do X, Y, or Z if not doing X, Y, or Z will preserve calories, because that's how our brains evolved, because 20,000 years ago, you didn't always know where your next meal was coming from. So priority number one, preserve calories. So we have to be aware that our brains are often working against us, and try to use our other super ability, which is predicting the future, which is what our super awesome human brains like to do, and plan ahead. Okay, so let's go ahead and right click this header of the dope sheet and do flip to bottom, because that's a little cluttered there. I think in general, I think about this much space is good. I think this is a pretty happy medium between not taking up too much of your main 3D view to work on projects, to model and things like that, but still having enough space. If on a whim you want to animate, you can, and not have to adjust anything to see 2 or 3 objects, and start playing around. Next thing we want to do is come down to this filter and turn off this summary here. So this summary bar will display a point to represent anywhere on that frame there is a keyframe for the object you have selected, or if you have only show selected disabled to show the keyframes of all objects, then it will show a point there. Mostly this is pretty useless and it just takes up space. So let's turn it off. Next thing I want to talk about is, so by default, we can see if I tap space here to play the animation back, by default, Blender displays the timeline as just frames. And so your mind doesn't understand what 10 frames, 30 frames, or 40 frames are without first having to decode how that relates to time. So this is another point of friction that can get in the way, make it more difficult for us to animate. So to get over that, what we can do is come here and under View in the dope sheet, change this to show seconds. All right, so now we're seeing a seconds display. So from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, but then it's got this kind of like weird, like the second plus which frame of the second it's on. And that can be useful in some situations, but generally that's not something you're going to need starting out. So let's go to Edit, Preferences, and under Animation, let's change this time code style to only seconds. And now we're getting to something a bit more human readable, and something we'll have to spend less time decoding in our brain to make a decision about how to move an object or how it relates to 1 second or 2 second or like a half second, things that are much more relatable in your brain. Okay, so we've still got an issue here, because what would be nice is we'd like to see this divided by individual seconds. So we want this to be 0 to 1, not 0 to 1.3, and then 2 to 2.7. So what we need to do is adjust this minimum grid spacing value until this changes to something to where we get those whole second readouts. That's looking to be about 65 pixels here. Of course, this will be different depending on the resolution scale you have your interface set to and the resolution of your computer screen. So you'll have to change this to whatever until you can get these to appear how you want them to. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's go to the Output Properties tab here. And under Dimensions, so the default frame rate is 24 frames per second. And that's kind of a legacy thing with film. Film has been traditionally shot at 24 frames per second. However, most things these days are either 30 or 60 frames per second, or some interval of 30. For instance, pretty much any phone you find is going to record at 30 frames or near 30 frames. If we go ahead and switch this to 30 frames per second, this will start training our brain to deal with something, a value that's, number one, fairly easy on your computer, no matter what your system is, and number two, easily translatable to 60 or another frame rate that's a multiple of 30. So I think this is a better default frame rate to set this to. Another thing going on here is we have the default frame start in Blender is at 1. As you can see here, it says 0, but I can actually move this all the way back, and you'll see here's the actual frame we're on. We're on frame 0. And you'll see that the black part of the beginning of the animation goes a little bit past the timeline. And that's because this frame start is set to 1. So what can happen here is that the default layout starts out with this here with this actually at frame 1, and then so you can end up animating something, and then you just quickly, without thinking about it, drag your timeline all the way back and it goes to 0, and then you press space to play, and there's like this weird blip depending on what you got going on, or there's like this weird offset because this isn't at 0. So let's change this to 0 so there's no confusion there, and the beginning of the timeline is the actual beginning of the timeline. And so this default timeline starts out with a beginning and end animation of about 10 seconds. That's when it was at 24. When we raised it up to 30 frames per second, that became less time. But even then, I think that's a little short. Actually, I think 15 seconds is a better amount of time for playing around with, especially when you get into messing around with Blender's rigid body physics or letting a simulation play out or something like that. It's just a good default time. And it also makes sense in terms of being able to animate a little bit of something over here and then animate a little bit of something over there and then mix those things together. It just gives you a bit more of a whiteboard and breathing room. So let's bump this up to 450, which will be 15 seconds at 30 frames per second. And so now what I want to do is scroll my mouse wheel, because you can zoom in and out of the dope sheet or timeline or whatever. And I want to get all of those 15 seconds in here so I can see where the beginning of my animation window is and the end of it. Okay. But I also want to be able to still see 0, 1, 2, and so on. So you can scroll your mouse wheel up and down to zoom, but you can also hold Control and then press down on the middle mouse button of your mouse, and then drag your mouse left and right to more precisely zoom this. And that's what I'm going to do so I can get these displayed here. I want to see, and I may have to bring up the preferences again to adjust the minimum grid spacing here, maybe a bit high. Let's maybe drop that down to 55. There we go. I want to see the beginning, the end, and then clearly as much space as I can between each second. Okay, great. Now I have a nice readout of individual seconds, and you might not be able to see it because of YouTube compression, but I can see the half-second line too. And this is now a much less friction environment. There's much less my brain has to do when thinking about a half second of time or a couple of seconds of time in terms of animating. All right, so I'm going to get rid of the preferences. Okay, a couple more things we want to set up here to make it easier to animate. So of course, to insert a keyframe, we can press I, and this will bring up the Insert Keyframe menu if you don't have a keying set selected. So one of the most common keying set used is location, rotation, and scale. And this is because this inserts a keyframe for basically anything you can do to the object in terms of transforming it. So if I say rotate it, scale it, and then move it over here, inserting a keyframe for all three of these values would insert a keyframe for all of that information. So if you want to avoid having to bring this menu up, you can come to where it says keying and select a keying set. Let's go ahead and click this one because it's going to eventually allow us to avoid having to change keying sets all the time when moving between armatures and bones. So that'd be good for our default startup file, armatures and objects rather. Now, if I tap I, we don't get a menu anymore. We just get all of those keyframes entered, and then we could move our timeline down, do something else, scale it or rotate it, whatever. Press I again, and of course, all of those changes are tracked and animated. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, what's the point of all this other stuff, all these other keying sets, if that one does everything? Well, there are actually situations where you don't want to key location or scale, and you just want, say, rotation or something. So say, for instance, let's delete this, Shift A, add another cube. Say, for instance, I pressed I to insert a keyframe, and then I move this down a second, and then I pressed R to rotate, and then press middle mouse to constrain it in some direction and rotate it a bunch. And then I'll hold Control to do it straight like that, and then tap I again. So I've rotated this cube like this. Say I was making some kind of gear or something, and then I wanted to make another version of that, so I pressed Shift D to duplicate, and then middle mouse to constrain. And I like put it over here or something. It's like, all right, so I've got these two spinny things. Now let's go. No, what happened? It disappeared. So the cube didn't disappear. The cube 0.001 we just duplicated. What happened was it duplicated all of the animation data, including the location data that we keyframed because we told Blender to do that, include location. So it's now jumped back to that same spot because that's what the data says to do on that keyframe. So here is a situation where we could go ahead and delete all the keyframes, and actually probably delete that too. Here's a situation where you would actually want this keying set to just be, say, rotation. So if we did the same thing, we press R to rotate, middle mouse to constrain, we'll do it this, or rather, let's tap I to insert a base keyframe, then go down a second, R to rotate, middle mouse to constrain, hold Control, do that a couple times, tap I again. Now, if we were to Shift D, duplicate this, move it down, we did not key the location data, so we're just getting rotations. So keep in mind there isn't actually a point to paying attention to this, but in general and as a default and as a way to quickly blueprint out things and just get something on the board real quick and test some stuff, location, rotation, scale, and then now the location, rotation, scale with the custom property, so we don't have to fool with changing our keying set when animating bones way down the road, is the one to set for your default keying set. In the next video, we're going to go over 4 examples of animating in the dope sheet here. We're going to use grease pencil mode, shape key editor, action editor, and the dope sheet. We're going to be animating material properties, so I'll show you how that works, and we're going to be combining those all together. So if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and stay tuned for that next video. Real quickly before we go, I'm going to shift select both of these cubes, X to delete them, and add another cube so that my default cube isn't like cube 0.00 whatever for when we save this startup file. And I'm going to switch my default properties panel editor tab to modifiers because that's what I most want to use whenever I get started. And then this really isn't an animation related thing, but it's just kind of a personal pet peeve that I'm going to adjust for my startup file. So I haven't really rotated the screen at all when we open Blender, and this is the default way Blender looks at the screen. And so every time I see this for some reason, my brain wants to think that this dark shaded section of the cube is the front. What I'll do is I'll rotate the screen a little bit. It's because I think that's the front, and I think, okay, now I'm staring at the front. But I'm not. That's not the front. Actually, this at -y puts us in a front orthographic view, or you can press the 1 on the numpad keys if you have a big keyboard on the far right, the big block of numbers. If you press 1, that will also bring you into front orthographic view. So that's a little disorienting to me, and it's just another thing that takes up time before I get started actually working. So I like to make sure I am staring directly in front of the cube here. But then I am going to go ahead and grab the camera, G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, because I like the default setup. I like seeing things like how I'm used to. I just don't like the fact that what I think is the front view is never the front view, and then I always end up having to rotate the screen. And then we want to make sure that the cube is the default object selected because, you know, most likely that's what you're going to be working on. So now that we have everything like we want it, we can go to File, Default, Save Startup File, click the button, and now no matter what we do, no matter how we mess up our screen or change stuff or whatever, if we go to New, General, and then press Don't Save, we'll get our startup file, and this will be how Blender looks every time we open it, so that's great. The last thing I'll mention is that if you want to always keep your workspace looking the same, no matter what files you open, say you have a bunch of old files you saved and you don't want them messing up your nice fancy workspace you just set up, or, you know, when opening up files you downloaded online, Blender files, you can go to Edit, Preferences, and under Save and Load, uncheck Load UI, and then of course if you have autosave preferences enabled, that will just save that so you can close that out. And now your workspace will be stable no matter what file you open. So I think this is a much nicer environment to get started with animating and to remove a lot of friction that causes us to avoid animating. in Blender. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you're not subscribed, like this video, and stick around for part 2 of this little series of getting started animating in Blender. Because like I said, we're going to be going over these different modes, and we're going to make a little animation that combines the use of these different modes and can really get your feet wet in how to do all this stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.